Just sort out. Okay, we're recording now because I'll send you a copy. Okay, Wayne?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so you can, let me just introduce you and then you can start. Okay, good morning, class. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Wayne Fagan from the Dee Howard Foundation. And I want to thank him for taking his time off his busy schedule to meet with us. He's from Texas, and as we know, last week was a terrible week in Texas, right? Bad temperatures, floods, a lot of discomfort. But again, Wayne has consented to be with us today. So again, Wayne, I want to welcome you to the Trinidad and Tobago University, our aviation campus, and to allow you to share with us a history of the Dee Howard Foundation, what you've been doing, and probably how you might be able to assist some of the students in Trinidad who may be seeking to advise them on probably future aviation careers. So it's over to you.
Over to me. Well, thank you for reaching out to me. It's wonderful, the association we've had, and we look forward to many more years. We're excited about it. We brag about it everywhere. Where the Dee Howard Foundation started in San Antonio in 2013. And we now have some form of outreach, not only in San Antonio, but in Texas, in Houston and Galveston, Texas, and also in Taos, New Mexico, Ada, Oklahoma, and 2 cities in Florida. And of course Trinidad and Tobago, and we're delighted and we're expanding. I thought that, and I'm also delighted to see, I believe, some women on the screen. We're big proponents of encouraging, well, in Texas, women and minorities. So that basically in Texas is African-American kids and Hispanic, Latina, but besides Anglo-white. Just a brief word about the history of aviation in San Antonio. San Antonio is a large military city. It's called Military City, USA. We had our first military base in the late 1800s, early 1900s, called Fort Sam Houston, an Army base. There was no Air Force at that time. And in the early 1900s, there was a young lieutenant in the Army Signal Corps, which is where military aviation grew out of in the US, out of the Signal Corps. So he was based in Washington, D.C. His name was Lieutenant Benjamin Folloy. And he was sent here by his commander with a Wright Flyer aircraft. The Wright brothers had recently flown their airplane in North Carolina at Kitty Hawk. He was in touch with them. They shipped a Wright Flyer aircraft to Fort Sam Houston with Lieutenant Benjamin Folloy. And he learned to fly through letters back and forth with the Wright brothers. And so the first military aviation flight in the US occurred in San Antonio from the parade grounds at Fort Sam Houston, which is still here. And Folloy would say that every one of his landings was a crash landing, literally. And at that time, the aircraft that the Wright brothers was building had skids like snow skis, but skids on the airplane, no wheels. So when the plane would land, even though it was a grass field, as you can imagine, it stopped pretty quickly. And normally he would have to spend a lot of time repairing it. So he would be thrown out of the seat of the airplane. And so because of that, he is the one that came up with the idea of putting wheels on airplanes so that it would roll to a stop and not just have a sudden stop when it hit the ground. And so the idea of wheels for airplanes was born in San Antonio at Fort Sam Houston. Then the other thing that he did was, because he was always being thrown out of the seat, he went to the blacksmith shop. In those days, primarily the military had horses, not cars, and asked the blacksmith if he could design some kind of a belt that he could attach to the seat of the aircraft to hold him in the airplane. And so that was how the seatbelt for airplanes came about. So seatbelts for airplanes and wheels on airplanes started in San Antonio with Lieutenant Benjamin Falloy. So then there's a lot more history with military aviation in San Antonio. So moving to civil aviation for a moment, there were some famous people in the early days of aviation, civil aviation primarily, in the US called the Stinson family. There were 4 Stinson, S-T-I-N-S-O-N. There were 4 Stinson siblings, brothers and sisters. And they were from someplace in the South. And they were looking for a place to teach flying lessons. And they toured around the US looking for a place. And they came to San Antonio. They liked the weather here. And so they started their flying school, Stinson Flying School in San Antonio. And that eventually became Stinson Field. So that's part of the civil aviation history. Then, and I've already told you about the military aviation history. The other that I want to share with you is aerospace medicine, which San Antonio has played a huge role in aerospace medicine in the US and worldwide. If you might remember let's have a show of hands, how many people in your class ever heard of President John F. Kennedy?
Yes, sir.
A bunch, I hope.
Yes, sir.
Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So as you probably know, President Kennedy was assassinated. That assassination occurred in Dallas, which is about 6 hours drive from San Antonio. But the reason I mention it is that the day before President Kennedy was assassinated, he was in San Antonio dedicating what became what was known as Brooks Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Field here in San Antonio. And he was here the day before, and that's why he was in Texas to dedicate Brooks. He was here with then Vice President Lyndon Johnson and then Governor of Texas, John Connally, and other dignitaries. And there's a film on that we have on our website. Then he went from San Antonio to Dallas. And in fact, he was going to go from Dallas to Austin, Texas, which is our state capital. I was in university at that time in 1963 at the University of Texas in Austin. And my then girlfriend and I, later my wife, were going to go see President Kennedy in Austin. And I had fallen asleep in the library. And somebody came in and told me that President Kennedy had been assassinated. So lots of stories there with President Kennedy in San Antonio, lots of connections. In fact, talking about President Johnson, after President Johnson was president, well, even before, President Johnson's family had radio stations in Texas. That's where they made their money. And he had a ranch outside of Austin. And he had an aircraft that was a very famous aircraft. There's a lot about it on the website, called the Howard 500. And he owned that airplane for many years. And that's what he flew around in after when he left office after being president. And President Johnson would call Dee Howard up and ask him if he would send a flight crew up there to fly him someplace, and Dee would. And we have in our memorabilia a personal autographed photograph of President Johnson to Dee, thanking him for their friendship. So turning to Dee, the purpose of me telling the story about Dee and the reason for starting the foundation is not to build a monument to Dee. We could have commissioned a statue, I guess, and stuck it someplace, but to carry on his legacy. So of innovation, of work ethic, of honesty, integrity, of how he treated his employees. So the story about Dee is, I wasn't around in the early days. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough. But in the early days, so Dee had to quit school at the end of his 8th grade, because it was after the Depression in the United States, a horrible economic situation, not only in the US, but globally. And his father had had a stroke and couldn't work. So Dee quit school in the 8th grade and went to work in a gas station. In those days, I don't know how it is in Trinidad and Tobago today, but in the US, gas stations don't have attendants that come fill up cars with gas. It's all self-service. But in those days, it wasn't. And so Dee worked in a gas station starting when he was, I guess, 14 years old, maybe 13 years old. And he always had a creative side. He always had an ability he was very mechanical. So the story he tells is, and in those days, cars didn't have electric windows. They were roll up and down windows, and they didn't have air conditioning. And so one day, it was cold, Dee said, and it was raining. And a man came in his car to get some gas. And he went into the gas station to go to the restroom or buy something. And Dee was putting gas in the car and noticed that the driver's side window was rolled down. It was not rolled up, and it was raining and it was cold. So while Dee was putting gas in the car, he looked at the window to see what the problem was, and it wouldn't roll up and down, and he fixed it while the guy was in the gas station. And he came out, the owner of the car came out and noticed that the window was up, and he thanked Dee for that and said that he couldn't pay him for it. He said, well, you don't owe me anything. It's cold and rainy and happy to do it. So Dee said after that, he thought, if I'm going to make any money in the world, I need to find a job where I don't mind charging people for my services. So he thought about airplanes. He said, anyone that owns an airplane probably can afford to pay me. And so he quit his job at the gas station. He went out to what was then Stinson Field. This is in the 30s. And he got a job just to be at the airport there. That was the only airport in San Antonio. Sweeping floors, and then just to be around airplanes. And then he started talking to the people that had airplanes there, and he got a job as a trainee mechanic, and he became an aircraft mechanic. At that time, Braniff Airways was at that airport. A company called Slick Airways, which was the first all-cargo national airline in the U.S., was there. And then what now is San Antonio International Airport was being built. And it was during World War II, and when it was completed and opened up, the commercial airlines from Stinson moved over to San Antonio International. And Dee was a foreman for Slick Airways at the time. And there was a storm coming up, and there was only like 1 or 2 hangars at the airport. And Dee needed to get the Slick Airways airplane into a hangar before this storm arrived. And so Dee Howard towed the first aircraft into the first hangar at San Antonio International Airport. In 1947, Slick Airways decided to move to California, to Burbank, California. Dee was 27 years old. And didn't want to move out, had a wife and 2 children, didn't want to move out to California, and quit his job at Slick Airways and started a company in a little wooden shed, which we have a picture of on our website, called Howard Aero. And he had a car, and he put his tools in the back of the car, and he drove around South Texas finding aircraft that needed mechanical work to do. And then Dee hired as his first employee at Howard Aero a gentleman by the name of Ed Swearingen, another legend in aviation. And then his second employee, after Ed Swearingen, was a gentleman by the name of Bill Lear Jr., who was the son of Bill Lear of the famous Learjet, which is how Dee got to know Bill Lear. They were lifelong friends. And Dee built a mock-up of the Learjet for Bill Lear in San Antonio. And so Dee always had a connection to Bill Lear and the Learjet. So time goes, so Dee grew Howard Aero into 1,000 employees in 10 years, building aircraft and designing aircraft and manufacturing aircraft and repairing aircraft. And that's a lot of employees for a guy with an 8th grade education. And Dee brought in 1962, Dee brought in a financial partner who insisted on having 51% of the company. So Dee gave it to him. And the within 2 years, the financial partner fired Dee Howard from the company that he started. And Dee started over in 1964 with $2,500 in his pocket, working at a loaned office at one of the other buildings on the airport. And by 1968, Dee started Dee Howard Company in 64, but he didn't have his first hangar till 67 or 68. And I met Dee in 1970, and he had 75 employees in 1970. And one hangar that you had to, it didn't have a cutaway to put the tail into the hangar. And so to put a 727 in that hangar, they had to jack up the nose of the aircraft for the tail to go down so they could stick it into the hangar. That's when I met Dee. 75 employees, and he had to do that to put a 727 in the hangar. I want to tell you about Dee had and his companies had. Are you familiar with STC, supplemental type certificates? Have you all gotten to that? No? So the certification to build a new aircraft, certainly in the US and anywhere in the world, there are certificating authorities. There's the FAA in the US. And so if you're building a new aircraft, you get from the FAA what is called a type certificate, a TC.
Okay.
And the Howard 500 received a TC. That was a new production aircraft. But if you modify an existing aircraft, you have to prove to the FAA that the aircraft is as good as or better than the aircraft before it was modified. And when you do that, you get a license from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, called a STC, a supplemental type certificate. And so Dee had, or his companies had, over 200 type certificates and supplemental type certificates. So for each one of those, he invented a product. And then he also had over 40 patents. So he was quite an inventor. So fast forward to 1970, and the Learjet was flying in the early 1970s. There were a lot of customers using it. And Dee told me the story that one day he was out, he had his company at the airport, and he was looking out his window, and it was cold and it was raining, and Learjets were used for corporate customers. So these were executives that were in the aircraft. So at that time, to stop or slow a Learjet down on landing, it deployed a parachute. Like, I don't know if you are old enough to remember, but in the old days when the space shuttle was flying and it would land, a parachute would come out. That's to slow it down. So that's how they landed Learjets in those days. And Dee said he watched the pilot, or co-pilot probably, get out of the aircraft while it's still on the runway, get out of the aircraft in the cold and the rain, and have to go to the back of the runway of where they landed and roll up the parachute and take this wet parachute, and put it in the cabin where the passengers were. And Dee said, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. And Dee developed out of that. So Dee set his mind to it and developed what's called the target thrust reverser for the Learjet. It was the first one. And at the time, and what he did was he went to Learjet owners, because he didn't have the money to do the R&D to develop it. And he said, if you pay me $20,000, give me $20,000 to develop this product, you'll get this special price for the product, and you'll be one of the first customers to have it. And and that's how he raised the money, and they trusted him. And that's how he got the money to develop the reverser. And at the time, Learjet was saying there was no need for the reverser, that what the system they had worked fine. Well, it turned out that after he developed the reverser, over 90% of the Learjets that were flying got his reverser, and it became standard equipment on the Learjet. So Dee became known as an expert in thrust reversers, target thrust reversers. Then one more thrust reverser story, just to give you an idea of how his mind works and what the opportunities are for you out there. So have you ever heard of the Concorde aircraft that was developed by British Aerospace and the French?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
There you go.
Yeah.
So there was a French engineer by the name of Etienne Fagan, who worked on the development of the Concorde, on the engine. And Etienne had developed a new technology thrust reverser. This is in the 80s, called a cold flow thrust reverser. Now, to explain that simply, on Dee's thrust reverser and on all the other thrust reversers, on target reversers, the hot gases come out the back of the jet engine. And when the target reversers are deployed, those gases hit the target reversers, and it redirects the gases towards the front of the aircraft and helps slow the aircraft down. So when those gases hit that reverser is pretty darn hot to the touch. And it's made of steel to withstand the gas. So what Etienne had developed is a way to direct the gases that come into the intake of the jet engine and channel them around, some of them around, so they don't go through what's called the hot section of the engine. And so what is hitting these target reversers on the cold flow system is cold air and not hot air. And when we first tested that, and Dee helped, he came to Dee to finish developing the product. And we had a test stand outside on the ramp. And the first time we tested it was in the summer in San Antonio, and out on the ramp, it gets pretty darn hot. And so it was like 100 degrees, and you had this jet engine and target and reverser on this stand, and you couldn't touch it. It was so hot. It's made of aluminum. And and they fired up the engine, deployed the reversers to see how it all worked. And at the end of the test, when everything was turned off, you could go over there and touch the reverser with your hand. It actually cooled the reversers down. And so it could be made lighter, so they're made out of aluminum and not steel, and weight is everything in an airplane. And prettier, because the target reversers made of steel, you couldn't paint them because the paint would just peel off with that hot gases hitting it. But with the target reverser, with the cold flow reverser, because they're cold, you could paint it. And so all these reversers started getting painted, and that's on, and our first customer was Hawker Siddeley on the Hawker 800 aircraft. So then the last invention story I want to share with you, and then we'll open up for questions, is in 1982, you probably have heard of Air Force One. So all heads of state have head of state aircraft. So up until 1982, there were no wide body head of state aircraft, meaning Airbus or Boeing 747s at the time. And in 82, Dee had 250 employees. And King Fahd of Saudi Arabia was going to be purchasing a brand new 747-300 aircraft for head of state aircraft. And King Fahd's emissaries had promised King Fahd that they would get him 3 bids for the interior completion of this aircraft. And since it had never been done before, no one would do it or would bid on it except Boeing. And Boeing was, they felt, the customer felt they were getting priced as if they were a sole source supplier. In other words, if we're the only game in town and you want it, we can charge you what we think is appropriate. So somebody in the Saudi group said, we got to get another bidder in here, if to do nothing else but to show Boeing that we got another bidder and to help us in our negotiations with Boeing. And so one of the people in the group said, well, I know someone that might do that. And they contacted Dee. Dee was that person. It was in 82. Corporate aviation was down in the doldrums. And said to Dee, told him the story and said, look, we'll pay your way over here, pay your expenses, and we'll give you $50,000 just to show up. So Boeing thinks we're negotiating with you. And so Dee said, okay, he never took the $50,000, but he said, okay. So he went over there, he was curious, learned more about the project. And it started with that discussion, as I told you. And 6 to 9 months later, we wound up with the contract to do the aircraft. So Dee Howard did the first wide body, he started the industry, the wide body head of state industry. And we did the first 4 wide body head of state aircraft done in the world. Saudi Arabia, King Fahd, the Sultan of Oman, the Sultan of Brunei, that was an Airbus, and Sheikh Zayed, who was the ruler of the United Arab Emirates. And now in the Saudi contract, I was with Dee in London when he signed the contract, and the contract required that the aircraft be in a hangar. There was no 747 hangar in San Antonio. And I pointed that out to Dee before he signed the contract. I said, you know, the aircraft's arriving the end of December of '82, Dee. This is like 6 months later. We signed the contract in the latter part of May of '82. I said, contractually, we're obligated to put the aircraft in a hangar. We don't have a hangar. They said, we'll get a hangar. And so we hightailed it back to San Antonio and went to work identifying a contractor to build a hangar. And we did that. And that picture is on the website. And on the day that the 747 arrived in San Antonio, as they were towing the nose into the hangar, we had workmen on the interior, on the ceiling of the hangar, putting the finishing touches on. So that was Dee. Lots more stories, but Dee would always tell me, maybe Mr. Benjamin is not going to like you to hear this, but I'll tell you what Dee told me. Dee said, Wayne, the toughest part of the commercial aviation business is MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, because it's the most competitive and therefore it's the least profitable. So what Dee was about is developing products that were his products that he could have a much higher profit margin on. And the customer would come to Dee Howard for the installation of the product, but some of these products were modifications to aircraft and might take 3 months, or maybe they were installations of thrust reversers that might take 10 days. But invariably, when the aircraft was in our hangar, they would say, well, since the aircraft's here, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? And so we did a lot of MRO work. Believe me, by 1988, we had over 1,500 employees and over 350 aerospace engineers. So we did a lot of MRO work, but it was to support the products that had been developed. And so lots more Dee Howard stories, but so now we get to the Dee Howard Foundation. So as I watched the Dee Howard Company grow from 75 employees to over 1,500 employees, and I got my university degree, my undergraduate degree in economics, focused on development of underdeveloped countries, I looked at the economic impact on our community of the growth of the Dee Howard Company, because he was the largest manufacturing employer in San Antonio. And not only was he hiring A&P mechanics and engineers, but there were people to fuel the aircraft, there were people to clean the hangars, there were people that worked in accounting, there was a whole infrastructure. And so it basically, between direct and indirect employees, it's about 4,000 employees in the community. That's a lot of economic development. That's a lot of people that go to restaurants or go to movies or buy clothes or pay taxes to support schools, on and on and on. And we have a high dropout rate in San Antonio, about 20%, from lower income kids and families. And I was interested in trying to help them. I was interested in carrying on Dee's legacy of aviation in San Antonio and innovation. So I thought about combining those two interests and using aviation and aerospace as a vehicle to interest underserved kids in science. And so that's why we started the Dee Howard Foundation. The mission of the Dee Howard Foundation is to honor San Antonio's aviation and aerospace history and to nurture our innovators of the future. And so we now, in 2015, we did our first educational program where we had 110 middle school underserved kids in a hangar and had an aviation career day for them and had a 4-time shuttle astronaut talk to them. And it really got their attention. I said, this is interesting. And so we developed what we call our pre-K through 16 plus, I'll explain that, Aeronautical STEM Pathway Initiative, where we now have developed educational programming from pre-kindergarten, which is like 4 years old, all the way through high school graduation, where we go to the school districts and work with them to create a pathway from elementary to middle to high school. And then we're working with one of the universities here in San Antonio, University of Texas at San Antonio College of Engineering, where we have developed a aeronautical engineering program, and that's growing. And the idea is that, before we came along, the economic development folks in the community were looking at workforce development programs, and they were focused on the high school. Our point is you have to fill up the pipeline. If you just start at the high school and try and get them, this is our view, if you try and get them interested in this stuff at the high school level, it's too late, pretty much. So you start younger, build up their interest, continue their interest, and create opportunities to further their education in high school and beyond. And so we have 2 tracks at the high school level. One is pure science, and the other is mechanical, in terms of taking courses in conjunction with a college to do to learn to be A&P mechanics. So we're now so we started that program in probably about 2016, 2017, in 1 school district in 3 schools. And we now have some form of a relationship. I phrase it that way because some of the schools don't have the full-blown curriculum. But we are now in, I may have mentioned this, I'm sorry, we have relations with about 40 different schools in San Antonio and surrounding area, in Taos, New Mexico, in Oklahoma, and in Florida. And we've developed this online portal that Mr. Benjamin has access to, which is our primary form of communication with the teachers involved in our programming. Then this semester, we're going to be starting a new part of that program, which will be virtual tours, where we will have one of our industry partners speak live to students in a class at a middle school or high school. And then that will be recorded. And we're doing that in collaboration with an organization called IDRA. And they have something called the Texas Chief Science Officers Program. And so the Dee Howard Foundation is partnered with the Texas Chief Science Officers Program. And that's where we're going. They have 16 schools, and that's where we're going to start this. But they'll record it, and they provide the technical support, and we provide the video support, and we provide the speakers. And then they'll record it, and they'll post the video on their website, and we'll post the video on, we have a pre-K through 12 open to the public, pre-K through 12 YouTube channel. And so it'll be open, and so those videos will be available there as well. And we're doing our first one. It's with a company, Mr. Benjamin, you can look it up. Pretty neat company here in San Antonio called Knight Aerospace, KNIGHT Aerospace. I think it's, that's the domain name. And what they do is they build modules, some interior modules, some medical modules that that go into cargo aircraft, C-130s primarily, and the C-17, which is the Boeing cargo aircraft. And so Knight Aerospace is going to do a tour of their facility as our first video. And then the idea is we'll change up the technology. You know, we'll do different kinds of technologies, like one of our colleagues, Mr. Benjamin, I sent you the link, is a aerospace engineer at UTSA, who specializes in hypersonic aircraft. And I imagine he'll do a tour, and then other really sophisticated technical experts will do tours. And we'll also do MRO work and different kinds of things, drones, well, just different things related to aviation and aerospace. So that's our next project. And with that, I've given you 50 years of aviation and aerospace experience and 7 years of building the Dee Howard Foundation in 45 minutes, and I'll shut up.
Well, Wayne, I want to thank you sincerely for all that you have shared, which is quite a lot. I hope the students would have benefited, because hearing what the extremes that and the contribution the foundation has made to the development of aviation, I never knew. You know, even when you spoke.
Not bad for a lawyer, huh? I'm not a pilot, and I'm not an MP mechanic, but I lived it. The reason I didn't become a pilot is a funny story. Dee and I grew very close, and he relied on me. And I spent a lot of time in his airplanes and a lot of time in the right seat of Learjets and twin engine props. And he noticed that when we would be on trips together. Sometimes we were together, sometimes we weren't. And he said, Wayne, you have a choice to make. You can either be a pilot or you can be my lawyer. He said, because if you become a pilot, you're going to be distracted by what's going on as far as meetings is concerned, and you're going to kill yourself. And because that happens, you know, there are part-time pilots that get killed because they're not concentrating. And he said, I've got a lot of pilots. What I need is a lawyer. So you can either be my lawyer or you can be a pilot and I'll get another lawyer. So I decided to be his lawyer and not his pilot. So that's why I never became a pilot.
Great. I don't know if any of the students have any questions for you. Anyone?
No, sir, no question.
Okay. Sometimes they tend to be a bit shy, you know.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. Well, if you and your class will permit, if you see something that is of interest or whatever, I would be happy to be invited back and do it again. And now that I've given the history and the broad overview, then it gives the students an opportunity to think about it, to look at it. I would encourage them to look at our, I've given you all the different links to our Twitter, Facebook. There are two Facebook pages. There's the Dee Howard Foundation Facebook page, and it started out as a heavily aviation history thing. So that's where the following is. And I post a lot of the educational materials on my personal Facebook page. So you have to look at both. Yeah, and there's a Twitter account. I'm not a Twitter person, but I do forward stuff of interest on Twitter. And then we have YouTube, and then of course the portal that Mr. Benjamin has access to. But so over time you get familiar with it, use it, follow us, and if you honor me with an invitation, I'm happy to come back again, and that will be more of a dialogue because I've given you the overview.
Sure. I thank you very much again. One more thing, I don't know if the students can put on their cameras so I can take a picture. Students, would you, if you can put on your cameras, please. I'm not too good at this, but I ain't seen any coming on really. Okay, so let's see. Wait, I want to get some more.
There you go. Good looking crowd.
Wait, come on. Where's this thing? I'm getting a glare. Tamaya, why? Why again this glare? Yeah. I hope I get some, and I'll send this to you, Dean, Wayne.
So what year are the students in school, Mr. Benjamin?
Oh, this is a certificate program. This is a one-year certificate program in aviation technology. We also have a 4-year degree program in the bachelor's degree, but they are just doing the certificate. So aviation, history of aviation is part of the curriculum.
So this is university level.
University of Trinidad and Tobago. So I'll send you a little more what we do, some pictures, and probably if you're available this evening, probably I'll touch base with you again. So again, I want to thank you and we'll talk later.
That's fine. We look forward to it.
Turn off the recording. Okay, and I'll send the recording to you.
Great, lovely.
All right, thanks again.
So what is English the primary language in Trinidad?